Today we're out here in windy southern Washington taking a look at the all-new 2020 Ford Explorer ST. This is the most performance-oriented Explorer ever built. We're talking 400 horsepower under the hood, rear-wheel drive biased, standard all-wheel drive system, and very grippy tires all the way around. These are 275 width tires. Now, rather unfortunately, we already know that this is not the most powerful Explorer already built, because if you're in Europe, you may be able to get your hands on the upcoming plug-in hybrid version of the Explorer. We don't know if or when that will ever make it to the US, but that model will get 444 horsepower and a whopping 620 pound-feet of torque. That is not this Explorer. Ford is positioning the new Explorer ST as an alternative to something like the Dodge Durango RT and perhaps a value alternative to something like the Dodge Durango SRT, but they're not calling this a direct SRT competitor just yet. Hopefully by this point you've already checked out our two existing Explorer videos, one on the all-new hybrid system and one on the base 2.3-liter turbocharged engine. For the ST, we get a slightly different look up front, although this is still easily identifiable as an Explorer because the overall shapes remain the same, this versus the other models. Up front we have LED headlamps, but these have been smoked out versus the headlamps that we find in the other trims. We have an LED accent strip on the top, and then the turn signal is inside this module. This bar down here, which could look like a turn signal in some of the competition, is actually the fog lamp. It's not positioned lower on the bumper. We have well integrated front parking sensors and of course Ford's autonomous parking system, so there's parking sensors right here on the sides as well. Other than the blacked out grille and headlamps, Ford keeps the markings pretty simple. We just have an ST badge right there on the front. When designing this generation of the Explorer, Ford decided to keep things pretty similar to the last generation in terms of overall dimensions. So this is 198.9 inches long, putting it sort of in the middle of the mainstream three-row crossover segment. This is 6 inches shorter than the Chevy Traverse and about 3 inches longer than the 2020 Toyota Highlander. Versus rear-wheel drive competition, this also slots somewhere in between things. So this is shorter than a Tahoe or a Dodge Durango and a little bit longer than a BMW X5. This is quite logically a value alternative to something like the BMW X5 because of the rear-wheel drive nature of this and the overall performance ability. The biggest thing you'll notice as you approach the Explorer is that this is very obviously a rear-wheel drive vehicle now because the front wheel has been pushed a lot further to the front and we have a longer wheelbase than the last generation model. That helps improve stability when you're towing and it helps improve the overall ride characteristics as well. These are 275 width tires on this model. There are two different tire options on the ST. This particular vehicle has the Michelin option. It's very clear that the Explorer was designed with these tire sizes in mind from the very beginning. Base models of the Explorer get 255 width tires, which are already among the widest in the mainstream segment, and then this model gets the 275 width tires, which are definitely wider than you'll find on anything else out there other than perhaps the Dodge Durango SRT. But these fit very well in the wheel wells, so if you wanted to get wider tires aftermarket, I suspect you'd still be able to fit them in the Explorer ST without major body modifications. Just like the front, out back we have relatively minimal differentiation between this and the rest of the Explorer lineup. We get the quad exhaust tips down at the bottom and some blacked off sections down there, and a black piece of trim right here instead of the chrome or other trim that we find in the rest of the lineup. But otherwise, this looks very much like the rest of the Explorers out there. We have combination LED tail lamp modules. That means that the parking lamp and the brake light over here in red are LED elements, and then the turn signals and backup lights are incandescent elements. The Explorer ST has a pretty healthy towing capacity for this segment of 5,600 pounds, so we have a 2-inch receiver right there and a 4 and a 7-pin wiring harness connection right in the middle. You'll notice there's no blank cover to cover off that area. That's my preference personally because I like to keep my ball and hitch just on the vehicle. I'm lazy that way and I have a lot of room to park, so I leave them on the car, and this looks a little bit more finished if you're in that situation. If, however, you tow very rarely, then this may look a little bit less attractive than covering it off like some folks like to. If you're after a raucous exhaust note, you should know that twin-turbo engines like this don't sound quite as entertaining as a big V8 like we find in the Durango SRT. Let's take a listen now. When you look under the hood, you'll realize that this is quite different than every other three-row crossover in America outside of the luxury entries. Instead of a base V6 engine like we find in the other rear-wheel drive entry, the Dodge Durango, we get a standard 2.3-liter four-cylinder turbocharged engine. And then the performance model that we're looking at here doesn't use a V8, instead it uses one of Ford's 3-liter twin-turbo V6s. That twin-turbo 6 is available in two different power levels. If you get the Platinum version of the Explorer, it produces 365 horsepower and 380 pound-feet of torque. It's going to be a little bit slower than the ST. This tune produces 400 horsepower and 415 pound-feet of torque. This isn't the first time that a Ford Explorer has had a twin-turbo 6-cylinder engine under the hood, but this Explorer is quite different because this is now rear-wheel drive, and it uses the same 10-speed automatic transmission, essentially, that we see in the Ranger and the F-150, which means it can handle an awful lot more power than the older transmissions that we found under the front-wheel drive Explorers. That means that even though the base 365 horsepower version of this engine seems like it's going to be about the same performance overall as the top-end Explorers of the past, you should know it's going to be faster. The high-output plug-in hybrid system that we see in the European Ford Explorer plug-in and the American market Lincoln Aviator plug-in hybrid uses the 365 horsepower version of this engine, same basic 10-speed automatic transmission, and then they insert an electric motor between the torque converter and the engine, and that's what bumps power all the way on up to those 444 horsepower numbers. Ford is, interestingly enough, not calling this a direct competitor to the Dodge Durango SRT that has a 475 horsepower 6.4-liter V8 engine in it. Instead, they're calling this the competitor to the Durango with the 5.7-liter V8 engine. That 5.7-liter V8 produces less horsepower than this engine, and the Durango is also a little bit bigger, so this is definitely faster than that Durango 5.7. Front seat comfort in the ST trim goes up to 10 out of 10 points. These are some very comfortable seats, and the Explorer ST benefits from Ford's active massaging seat design. So we have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support and the active massage feature, which has an anti-fatigue seat bottom cushion and then air bladders on the seat back that massage. Overall, this massage is not as aggressive as what we see in the luxury segment, so this is not going to massage as well as, for instance, a Volvo XC90 or a Land Rover Discovery or a BMW with their active seat massage functionality, but this is definitely better than anything we see in the direct competition in the mainstream segment. None of those offer seat massage functionality at all. We also have a tilt telescopic steering column that's electrically actuated and a 3-position memory over there on the door. Unlike even some luxury alternatives, the front passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's seat, and it also gives us that seat massage functionality. Even though the Durango is a little bit longer on the outside, it doesn't have as much legroom on the inside as we find in the Explorer. The main reason for that is that the Durango was designed to accommodate that big 6.4-liter V8. This vehicle was designed to accommodate a 3-liter V6 engine. That means the hood doesn't need to be as long, we can get more room on the inside. Ford says that at the moment this is going to be available only with the bucket seats that we see here in the second row. These do recline and they move forward and backward as well, so you can apportion legroom front, middle, rear a little bit more equitably. At the moment, the second row just has captain's chairs here, but we're told by Ford that later there will be a bench seat option, so if you want your Explorer ST to be able to carry 7 passengers, that will be an option a little bit later. The third row back there only holds 2. That means that there is no 8-passenger version of any trim of Explorer. Hopping into the third row is pretty easy with these tilt and slide second row seats, but it's worth noting that you cannot leave a child seat latched into position and do that with the second row seat. Hopping back here into the third row, if I move the seat all the way back and then tilt it back into position, my knees are just barely touching the seat, but I could very easily apportion the space more equitably, sit up there in the front row, sit in the second row at 6 feet tall, and have enough room back here in the third row. The big takeaway with the Explorer third row is that headroom is quite generous back here. My hair is just barely brushing the ceiling if I'm sitting very upright in the seat. If I'm sitting in a more normal position, I have about 1.5 inches of overall headroom left. That's just due to the overall shape back here as it gets closer to that rear hatch. In terms of third row headroom, this matches the Honda Pilot for best in the segment, definitely more than we find in the Dodge Durango, although it is worth noting these seat bottom cushions are pretty darn close to the ground, so it is going to be a little bit less comfortable for adults back here, but they're definitely going to fit back here better than some of those smaller 3-row crossovers. The cargo area in Ford's last generation model was very generous, among the best in the 3-row crossover segment, but this generation does suffer a little bit of a loss. We're now down to 18.2 cubic feet back here, which is the same whether we're talking about the base model, the Explorer ST, or the hybrid model, because the hybrid model has its battery pack under the second row seats. That means that we can't fit quite as much luggage back here as we could in the previous generation Explorer, but I think this is a worthwhile trade-off for the increased performance that we find in this model. Looking around the interior, keep in mind that we do have a few options that you won't find on the base ST model. There's this large panoramic moonroof right here above the driver and second row passengers' heads. Up front, we have height adjustable shoulder belts and 4-way ratchet style headrests. Those ratchet into place right like that. Leather upholstery and ST embossed on the seat backs. The seat back and bottom cushion are perforated because the seats are both heated and ventilated. We have a little bit more aggressive bolstering than we see in the rest of the versions of the Explorer lineup, but this is still not quite as aggressive as some of the European options. So if you're a slightly larger person and you're worried about fitting in here, I don't think you'll really have a problem. The white contrasting stitching continues as we move on over to the door, so you can see that that door panel right there has that contrasting stitching. And this vehicle has the optional up-level Bang & Olufsen sound system, so you can see that we get an additional speaker grille right there on the door. There are two different B&O sound systems. One does not have this speaker right here, it just has the one right there by the window switches. There are two different B&O systems in the Explorer. One has this extra speaker right here in this trapezoidal shape. The other one has a speaker only right here by the door lock and unlock button, and then one lower on the door right there by that bottle holder. As always, it's a little tricky to film darker interiors, but the interior shapes are the same as the rest of the Explorer lineup, but we get different trim right over here on the driver and passenger side. This has sort of a carbon fiber effect to it. On the passenger side, we also find a decently sized glove compartment. I was able to fit a standard sized iPad in there, but some of the very large tablet computers may have troubles fitting. Depending on the options that you select, your 2020 Ford Explorer will have one of two infotainment systems. One has an 8-inch screen. It's a lot shorter than this. It doesn't extend quite as far down the dashboard or quite as high above the dashboard. And then we have this option right here, which looks like a large tablet computer perched on the dashboard in this portrait orientation. The software running both of these systems is essentially the same. The difference is really just the screen size and the screen orientation, and the fact that if you get this larger screen, we do lose the storage bin right down there at the bottom. If you want to know more about this infotainment system, there's going to be a separate video just on this coming up tomorrow. Again, below the infotainment screen, we don't have that storage cubby that we saw in the model with the smaller screen. We then have some buttons for that infotainment system: power, volume, tune knob, track forward, backward, direct access buttons to the camera, parking sensors right there. The controls for the tri-zone automatic climate control, heated and ventilated seats. The tri-zone climate control is standard. Going down from there, we have a large storage compartment. I was very easily able to put larger smartphones in there, and I think some smaller tablets may even fit. There's a 12-volt power port and two USB inputs. One is a USB-C. If I close this lid, then there's a larger area right there where you could probably also put smartphones, although you may end up scratching that lid a little bit. One nice touch is that there's a little gap for cables to come out of there, so that if you wanted to put your smartphone, for instance, in this little slot right there, you could definitely do that. In the middle of the shift knob, there's a manual button, so if you're in drive, you use that to control the manual mode for the transmission. We have an electric parking brake, auto brake hold, auto start stop enable disable, traction control enable disable, hill descent control, autonomous parking, and then a drive mode knob right here. Depending on the Explorer that you're in, you may either have buttons or a knob for the drive mode. Because we have a few more drive modes in this vehicle and we have some of these other functionalities, we get this rotary knob here that allows us to choose between tow haul, sport, eco, normal, slippery. There's a trail mode and a deep sand and snow mode as well. There are two large cup holders over there on the right side, and then a softly padded armrest cover that reveals a moderately sized storage compartment. Remember, this is a rear-wheel drive vehicle, so the transmission is under there somewhere, but I suspect you may be able to fit a gallon of milk in here, although you probably won't be able to close the lid. On the driver's side, we have this large full-color LCD instrument cluster. This is not standard in the Explorer, but we do get it in the top-end trims. You can see we have off-road information over here on the right, trip computer right there in the middle, and the display is configurable as well. We can get readouts of the four-wheel drive system, off-road status moved right there to the middle. If we move from one drive mode to the other, you can see we get some decent animations there, but overall this display is not quite as configurable as some of the modern Cadillac screens. The steering wheel is a modified version of what we find in other Explorer models. It has a flat bottom, more aggressive padding, especially right here at this position, and then larger sport grips up top. There are paddles on the back of the steering wheel, up on the right, down on the left, and they do move with the steering wheel, but the center section is the same as the rest of the Explorer lineup. So on the right side, we have buttons that control that multifunction LCD instrument cluster, phone, hang up, and pickup buttons, along with track forward and backward, voice command, volume up, down, and mute on the left side, and then the controls for the radar, adaptive cruise control, and lane keeping assistance. The Explorer ST is finally the Mustang of crossovers. Rear-wheel drive, 400 horsepower, and even though this does have a standard all-wheel drive system, it's very clearly biased towards sending power to the rear. That's a lot easier to do with this all-wheel drive system than, for instance, the Acura Super Handling all-wheel drive system that we see in the MDX, the RDX, etc. Those systems can send 70% of engine power to the rear under certain circumstances. But the under certain circumstances part is the key to understanding those systems, because this system could send 100% of engine power to the rear at all times if it wanted to. That's because with this all-wheel drive system, it's not possible to disconnect the rear axle, and that's really the key to the performance that we see in the Explorer ST. 0 to 60 happened out here in 5.1 seconds. That is definitely quick, significantly faster than the V8 version of the Dodge Durango. And I'm talking about the 5.7-liter V8 there, but not quite as fast as the SRT Durango. Now that's logical, of course, because the SRT Durango has an extra 75 horsepower on this engine. But really what's interesting is the immediacy of the power here. We get very little turbo lag, and all of that torque is available at very low RPMs. That's quite different than the last generation of the Explorer, even in its twin turbo form, because its transmission couldn't handle this much power, so they did have to limit power in those lower gears. This feels an awful lot more immediate, especially off the line. Braking times are also similarly short. This particular model stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 118 feet. This does have the Michelin tires on it though, so those numbers will change a little bit depending on the tire you choose on your Explorer ST. Overall handling is absolutely excellent. A lot of folks on Facebook.com were asking me to compare this to the Dodge Durango because it's the only other rear-wheel drive entry in this segment. This is simply the better handling option. The Explorer feels lighter, it feels more nimble, and you'll really notice that in corners, especially if you're looking at the Durango RT or the Durango Citadel rather than the SRT. Because the Durango RT and the Citadel, they do have kind of a heavy rear end feel. So as you go around a corner here, you get rear end lift in those vehicles that you just don't get in the Explorer ST. Instead, this goes very neatly around the corners, very much like a BMW X5. That's really the closest corollary I can think of to this model. And in my head, it would be the last generation X5, not the current generation, because the current generation got a little bit softer. And I think that Ford is still striking a good balance between overall ride and handling ability. So this seems a little bit firmer than the current generation X5, especially the X5 with the adaptive suspension. As you'd hope with a vehicle that has 400 horsepower on tap, traction is very, very good with the system. Ford has done an excellent job at sending power to the front when needed, but keeping the vast majority of it at the back. You can really tell as we're going around corners that they're not sending too much power to the front unless it's really needed to help aid traction. So this definitely still has a strong rear power bias to it. So in that respect, I would say that this feels a little bit more like a Jaguar F-Pace than something like a Mercedes-Benz GLE. You might be wondering why I'm making so many luxury segment comparisons to the Explorer ST. The main reason is that there's nothing in the mainstream segment that is like this, other than that Dodge Durango, which we already covered. There is simply nothing like this from even a manufacturer like Acura. The MDX has very different handling tendencies. This feels very neat, it feels tidy compared to some of those larger vehicles. Admittedly, it's not going to feel quite as nimble as something like an Acura RDX, but this still has a rear-wheel drive power bias that we don't find in that nimble Acura. This beefed-up steering wheel was a really nice touch in the ST trim. It reminds me a lot of the SRT wheel that we see from FCA products. A key difference between this and some of the other sports wheels out there is that it gets narrower at certain points of the wheel design. So if you're interested in holding a steering wheel that's chunky, you have good places to grip for that. But if you'd like something that's a little bit thinner, you could grip it in a different place and get a slightly different feel for the wheel. Now, speaking of steering feel is obviously muted because we do have electric power steering. But because this is a rear-wheel drive vehicle and the front wheels aren't doing as much, we do get more steering feedback than we see in the Mazda CX-9. Some of the folks over at facebook.com/AlexNautos were asking about comparisons between this and the Mazda CX-9. That's really not a fair comparison for the Mazda, because the Mazda is significantly slower even than the base engine in the Explorer. And then if we're talking about the Explorer ST, this goes 0 to 60 about 2.5 seconds faster. It also stops significantly shorter and handles significantly better. In addition to the very different kind of driving dynamics, which is the separator really between the Explorer and any of the other mainstream entries. So this versus a Honda Pilot, this versus an Acura MDX or a Highlander or anything along those lines, this is a rear-wheel drive crossover now, so it feels very, very different. When you're in a corner like this, if you add extra power, that'll actually help you go around corners, unless you're applying a bit too much. In most of the crossovers in America, adding extra power will not help you go around the corner in any neater of a fashion. It'll actually push you to the outside because of that rear-wheel drive layout and the fact that the weight balance is very front-heavy. That's one of the other things I noticed about the Explorer out here, is that this feels very well balanced. Now, this ST model does seem to be a little bit heavier up front than the 2.3-liter turbo. That's pretty logical since this is a heavier vehicle overall. But because this is rear-wheel drive, the transmission is right next to me. And that helps move power from the front of the vehicle to the rear enabling better neutral handling. So when you're power off in a corner and you're not hitting the brakes or the accelerator pedal, this is simply going to cut a sharper line than any of the direct competition that's front-wheel drive. Bottom line, out on the road, the Explorer ST is an incredible amount of fun. This is the kind of vehicle that it would be very easy to get in trouble with because there's so much power, there's so much grip, but the laws of physics still have to be obeyed. So if you enter that corner too fast, there's nothing that's going to help you, and you'll be able to get into those corners faster than in any of the competition. Now, versus something like the Dodge Durango SRT, I think that's kind of an interesting twist. The SRT definitely has this raw and visceral quality to it. I like the 8-speed automatic transmission in it a bit more than this 10-speed automatic, but it's about $10,000 more than this. And the SRT is not really going to grip the road better than this. We haven't had a chance to directly compare the vehicles back to back, but I wouldn't be surprised if this holds the road better than that SRT. A number of you over at facebook.com/AlexNautos asked me to talk about this 10-speed automatic transmission. I like it a bit more in this than in the hybrid. In the hybrid, it seemed to be a little bit disconnected at some times, a little bit more abrupt in the overall shifting. It's important to remember that this 10-speed auto has a ton of gears, so there's simply more shifting that's going to be going on as you accelerate, as you decelerate, as you're driving in a sporty fashion. The big thing to remember is that this transmission has more gears than the competition. So there's simply more gears that the transmission will be running through as you accelerate, as you decelerate, as you're starting to drive the vehicle a little bit harder. In addition to that, this transmission has a very aggressive lockup torque converter, so it's going to feel a little bit more like a dual clutch transmission under certain circumstances. You'll really notice that at lower speeds, when you're engaging first and second gear and you're driving in slow and go or stop and go traffic, this can feel a little bit herky-jerky at times because of that aggressive lockup with the torque converter. I think that most people will get used to it, and personally it didn't really bother me. But at the same time, if you dislike the way this transmission shifts in the Ranger or in the F-150, you're probably not going to like the way that it shifts in the Explorer. So how much will an Explorer set you back? Well, hopefully you've been saving your pennies, because before destination, this comes in at $54,740. We get the quad exhaust, we get the trailer tow package standard, and hill descent control as well. But if you want the upgraded brakes, the upgraded wheels, the red calipers, etc., those are options on top of that base ST model. Ford is considering the ST and the Platinum trim of the Explorer sort of co-top-end trims. The Platinum is a little bit more expensive because we have a few more standard features, but most of those features are available on the Edge ST, like those massaging seats, the bigger infotainment system, etc. At this point, some of you are no doubt thinking, well, what's the difference between the ST and the Platinum? Well, the Platinum doesn't get quite as much horsepower under the hood, so in our preliminary testing up here in Washington State, that resulted in a 0 to 60 time that was 0.2 of a second slower. So 5.3 seconds 0 to 60 in this vehicle versus 5.1 in the ST. We also get a slightly different look up front. We don't have the blacked out grille. You can see this is this sort of matte, shiny look. And we don't have the upgraded brakes. We also have different tires, although the tire size is the same. So if you were planning on putting aftermarket tires on the Platinum or on the ST, they're probably going to handle very similarly to one another. But the brakes aren't upgraded. Now, you'd have to do that aftermarket if you wanted to, and they would obviously fit, but that's not something that's going to come from the factory. As with the front, the big difference out back is that we have the shinier components right here on the liftgate and down there on the bumper, but we still have the quad exhaust tips down there. And the tow rating is the same, whether we're taking a look at the Platinum or the ST, both of them will tow 5,600 pounds. The interior is largely the same, although you can see we have upgraded materials on the dashboard. We have the stitched components right there, and then we have wood trim instead of the carbon fiber effect trim. The real loss on the inside is that we don't get the ST steering wheel, which I think is one of my favorite new car steering wheels at the moment. So we have the same steering wheel that we find in the rest of the Explorer lineup. We also get that full LCD instrument cluster behind it. Equipping the Platinum and the ST as comparably as possible, the two vehicles are going to be relatively similar in overall price tag. So you have to decide whether you want the extra horsepower of the ST or the slightly more polished interior of the Platinum. If my money were on the line, I would probably get the Platinum version for the upgraded interior components, and then I would swap out the tires to improve the handling and bring it in line with what we see in the ST. The Platinum also gets the shiny bits on the outside, which I do love, but unfortunately on the inside we lose the excellent ST steering wheel. As always, you'll have to wait until we can get our hands on one of these for a complete week so we can run it through our usual battery of comparisons, pricing analyses, and of course, detailed performance tests. In our tests up here, this went 0 to 60 in 5.1 seconds, but it was 90 degrees up here and we were testing this at 500 feet. All of our official testing is done at sea level and generally as close to 65 degrees as possible, because that's a temperature we can usually achieve year-round, so that way comparisons are as direct as possible. I suspect at home this may be about 1/10 of a second faster, so this may be about 5 seconds flat or perhaps even a little bit lower. Clearly at the moment in America, the Dodge Durango is the closest competitor to the Ford Explorer. Ford and Dodge are both mainstream brands rather than luxury brands, and they both have the highest horsepower figures in this segment. The Explorer ST straddles the Dodge Durango RT and SRT in terms of overall performance and overall pricing, which is pretty important. The Dodge Durango RT is going to get the 5.7-liter Hemi V8. It's going to be less powerful than this ST. It's going to be slower 0 to 60, but it's also going to be less expensive, almost $10,000 less starting than the ST right here at $54,000. But on the other hand, the Dodge Durango SRT is pretty darn expensive. It starts at $62,000. So the SRT Durango starts where the Explorer leaves off. Now, the Durango SRT is a sub 5-second 0 to 60 vehicle. This is right around a 5-second 0 to 60 vehicle. So the two are not quite in the same category, but this is definitely going to be less expensive and better overall value than the Durango SRT. Unless you need to tow. That's really what the SRT brings to the table, is its increased tow rating as well. Up to 8,700 pounds, this one comes in at 5,600 pounds. So the Durango SRT is really an odd duck here because it's trying to compete in some ways with a Chevy Tahoe with its towing ability, but also with the Explorer ST in its performance ability. The Durango SRT sounds incredible. That 6.4-liter V8 engine has an absolutely incredible sound to it, but the Explorer ST feels better out on the road. This definitely feels more put together, more stable, more solid, and more like a European luxury rear-wheel drive vehicle. Which brings me along to my second comparison, which is a BMW X5. Strangely appropriate for this generation of the Explorer. In previous generations, I would have said that was an irrational comparison, but a rear-wheel drive Explorer with available all-wheel drive, same kind of system that we find in the BMW X5 in terms of overall system design. 3-row vehicle. Overall, it's not too much bigger than a BMW X5. It's more logical to do this comparison than Durango versus X5, for instance. And driving this out on the road, the Explorer reminded me a great deal of a BMW crossover. We have very similar driving dynamics. We have that near perfect 50-50 weight balance in most models of the Explorer, and that's really obvious when you're out on the road. This doesn't push in the corners like something along the lines of an Audi Q7, for instance. So I would say this is a more appropriate competitor to a Mercedes-Benz GLE or a BMW X5 than even the Audi Q7. And that should really say something about this generation Explorer, that we're able to have a conversation about BMW versus Ford in this same way. Now, obviously, the BMW is going to be more expensive. It's going to have a nicer interior. It's going to have nicer overall fits and finishes, that sort of thing. But that's not what I'm talking about here as far as comparisons. I'm talking about the way the vehicles feel out on the road. Another thing that's surprisingly similar is overall 0 to 60 performance, because the BMW X5 with the base 3-liter turbocharged engine posts surprisingly similar 0 to 60 numbers to this Ford Explorer. Depending on exactly what run we were counting, the two were either identical or the Explorer was a little bit faster than that BMW. But the BMW is surprisingly quick versus its official numbers. Now, of course, if you're BMW shopping, you could get a twin-turbo V8 in your BMW X5, and that would be significantly faster than this, but it would also be about $20,000 more expensive when comparably equipped as well. And in many ways, that particular BMW model would be a better corollary to the optional plug-in hybrid system that we see in European versions of the Ford Explorer coming up soon, or the plug-in hybrid version of the upcoming Lincoln Aviator. Bottom line, the Explorer ST is an incredible amount of fun in a 3-row crossover wrapper. I was really worried that my expectations for the Explorer ST would be set too high, but this managed to beat everything that I was thinking it would be. Admittedly, I had hoped that this would be just a tiny bit faster 0 to 60. I hoped that perhaps it would be SRT equaling in terms of 0 to 60 performance, but in terms of overall handling ability, driving dynamics, seat comfort, interior refinement, etc., this is definitely at the top of the category. And again, remember, this is notably less expensive than the SRT as well. So if you're looking to inject a little bit of extra fun in your family crossover, you should definitely put the Explorer ST on your shopping list. As usual with performance models, you should expect to see dealer markups on the ST trim of the Explorer at the beginning, but if you're patient and you're willing to wait about, say, 12 months after this vehicle is first on sale in America, you'll probably start seeing it right there around MSRP, or probably start seeing some of those deals that we've seen on other Explorer models. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. And as always, let me know what you think we should be comparing this to when we do get our hands on it for a complete week to run it through our full battery of comparisons and pricing details. In the meantime, you can join us by hitting that button down there at the bottom of your screen. That'll help support this channel. You can also click over to patreon.com if you want to make a monthly adjustable payment. Find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Twitter, Instagram, all those various things, and I'll see you next week.